ուղղակիցնը։ Իմ անունս Լորի Մանտիկյանն է և ուրախ եմ ներկայացնելու օրվան հանախոսը Dr. Peter Cowe, հայ լեզվի և մշակույթի դասախոս, ինչպես նաև Նարեգացի անվան հայագիտության ամբիոնի վարիչ UCLA համալսարանի Անցյալին ան եղած է Երուսաղեմի հրեական և Նյու Յորք Կոլումբիա համալսարաններու հայագիտության դասախոս։ Dr. Cowe սերդած է միջնադարյան հայոց պատմությունը, հայկական աստղագիտությունը, հայ քրագանության արժեքը և հայկական շարժանկարներն ու թատրոնը։ Dr. Cowe հեղինակն է հայ թատրոնի մասին 5 գրքերով։ Իր գրությունները շարունակաբար կհրատարակվին հայ ուսումնասիրական վարպետաթերթի մեջ։ Dr. Cowe արժանացած է Հայաստանի մշակույթի նախարարության բարձր քննադատին։ Հայագիտության մեջ կատարած իր աշխատանքներուն համար։ Ներկայիս ան ուսումնասիր է հայ համայնագիտարանը, ինչպես նաև Գիրիկյան Հայաստանի կացությունը։ Այսօրվան դասախոսությունը կհովանավորեն Տեր և Տիկին Պետրոս և Ֆլոր Իզանյան։ Շնորհակալություն ձեր ուշադրության, այս ժամանակին ձեր փչիչային հեռացանները կխնդրեմ անջատեցեք և հրամեցեք Dr. Cowe։
Շատ շնորհակալություն այդ ներկայացման համար և արևել ևս աջուստ ձեր շատ քերեսիկ հրավերի համար, շատ բարգեմ պարոն Վահի Հայրիկյանին այդ հրավերը փոխանցելու համար և հիմա ուրեմն իմ սելիքը հիմնականում ուրեմն գրածել անգլերեն, այնպես որ ձեր թույլատվությամբ անգլերեն լեզվով պիտի ներկայացնեմ, բայց հարց պատասխանի ժամանակ հարցեր որ կունենաք, եթե ուզեք ներկայացնել կամ անգլերեն հայերեն, կփորձեմ ուրեմն ձեզի կոհացնել և պատասխանել։ Հիմա ուրեմն հիմնական ինչպես արդեն ըսվեցավ, ես պիտի ուզեի խոսիլ այսօր հայկական թատրոնի պատմության մասին, բայց իմ հիմնական գետը, իմ հիմնախնդիրը պիտի լավ ծևը, որ թերևս ուրեմն ձեզի համար նորությունը պիտի լավ վստահեմ, այդ ուրեմն հայ թատրոնի աշխարհայնացման պրոցեսի մասին է, այսինքն գլոբալիզացիա, ասի նույն մենք ընդհանրապես ուրեմն ավելի կմնացենք այդ մասին, ինչ կվերապերի դեսությանը, բայց ալի նույն չափ բավական ուժեղ շարժում է նաև մշակույթի ձիրի մեջ, այնպես որ իմ շեշտադրումը ճիշտ ադորվրա բնիլա այսօր։ It has given me then the opportunity to put together some thoughts on the relation of Armenian culture to the broad impact of the process of globalization, which has been gestating worldwide over the last few centuries. We tend to associate globalization with our own generation and features like the rise of transnational corporations, the pollution of the global environment, the immediacy of the World Wide Web, and most strikingly, the widespread export of American products, be it McDonald's or Hollywood, especially as the US, of course, is acknowledged as the sole superpower worldwide. All these factors threaten the integrity of other nation states that lack the finance and the infrastructure to compete effectively in their home market. However, when we consider the origins of globalization in the rise of the capitalist economy and the increasing integration of world markets, we realize the importance of the role of the merchant middle class, together with the expansion of the government's direct control over all territorial administration under its jurisdiction. Similarly, the construction of the nation-state and the concept of a national culture, as we now understand it, are also products of an earlier phase of this same process of globalization. My thesis then is that Armenians became involved in this process relatively early, and not only promoted its impact on their own culture, but also exported it to their neighbours in various ways, one of the most striking of which is exactly through drama and theatre, in part because of the Armenian relatively long modern tradition. So, let's begin. Armenian culture, of course, is enormously diverse. From earliest times, Armenians were geopolitically situated to take advantage of trade, not only then in commodities, but also in concepts and styles and symbols, transported over the Eurasian thoroughfares between East and West. This is particularly the case in the empire of, I'm sure it's very clear for an audience like this, who we have represented on this coin. This, of course, is Tigran II, and we're now in the 1st century BCE. And we see his wealth extending then from sea to sea, all the way from the Caspian right through to the Mediterranean. So, of course, a very important period in Armenian history for international exchange, also in the field of culture. So, following the general trends of the Hellenistic period of the time in the Eastern Mediterranean, Armenia's Ardashir dynasty sought to adorn its capitals, for example at Tigran with Greek-style theatres. Perhaps along this sort of structure, here of course we see an open-air Greek amphitheatre, very typical sort of structure of this period. The seats arranged over the hillside, the palaestra, the dancing floor right in the centre, and then of course closing the prospect we have the proscenium, and of course this marvellous view behind. So it's presumably this sort of theatre that we will find when Tigran is excavated. And of course we have several of those, including one that was just recently found in Karabakh. And Hamlet Petrosyan and his group are excavating that now, and it's quite possible that one of the major finds will be something like this. So we wait to hear further news. One of the kings of this Armenian dynasty, Artemas II, from 55 to 34 BCE, composed a series of tragedies, there again I'm sure that some of you are aware of this, in the Greek language. And these were still available in the 2nd century CE, and they were read by the Greek historian Plutarch. But unfortunately, like so much of ancient Greek literature, they have not survived until our own day, so that we also could have the benefit of reading them. So, we pass over several centuries until we find renewed evidence of Armenian drama. And I want to emphasize that fundamentally I'm going to be talking about drama, not theatre. Theatre, of course, is much, much wider. All sorts of things enter into the heading of theatre. Many of which, of course, are slapstick, it could be largely dance. There is no fixed text. This is one of the key issues. When we're talking about drama, we have an actual play, there's a fixed dialogue, and a very clearly developed plot. So it's largely that I wanted to highlight today. In the 4th century CE, as you all know, many of you, of course, were here for the Sub Adarak this morning, Armenia accepted Christianity. And theatre operated for some time under ecclesiastical opposition in the early period. Then, paradoxically, we see the impact of pageant and ritual manifesting itself actually on a number of ceremonies in the church. And this is particularly true of the most solemn period of the year, which of course is Holy Week for Avak Shabbat. And I'd like to focus your attention on two of these. The first, of course, is the Tonum Pansek rite on Palm Sunday. And here we see that rite in process in the church. And the second, of course, is the Vodanava, the washing of the feet, which takes place on Holy Thursday. And there is someone you all know who is involved in that process, of course, in the Mayavank in Antelias. In addition, we hear of several secular forms of theatrical performance involving song and dance and extempore interchange, both at the aristocratic and the rustic levels in Armenia. In this connection, we should mention the dramatic art of storytelling of the Gusans. And here, actually, his head, of course, appears above the screen. The Gusan, the bard, reciting tales of ancient gods and heroes. So it's from this sort of background that we get Vahagni Tnunta, the birth of Vahagni, Arakeretsigyev Shamiram, Ardashesyev Satanik. These sorts of tales that we now have in Moses Kornatsi originally would have been sung with gesture by these Gusans to the accompaniment of a lyre. Thereafter, we move through the gates, of course, of the Bagration capital of Ani, taken by the Seljuks in 1064. We rapidly move to Cilicia, the center of the very important kingdom, until 1375. And thereafter, we note in the 16th century that the historic Armenian homeland becomes a theatre of war between the Ottoman and the Safavid empires until they established their international border. During these centuries, particularly the 16th, we see the Armenians created a complex network of trade colonies in the Crimea. Perhaps it's easier if we move to the next slide. Yeah, in the Crimea, in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, various Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, the Georgian capital of Tiflis, the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, and in the 16th century to a number of Russian provincial centers like Astrakhan, and then of course to North Nakhichevan, up in this area here, in 1780. This gave rise to an extensive urbanized Armenian middle class, with power residing in capital, not land, and a high degree of mobility to pursue the most lucrative markets, something, of course, that continues in the Armenian diaspora until our own day. These Armenian communities possessed various skills and were highly educated, not according to the traditional monastic curriculum, so classical Armenian grammar, Bible, philosophy, theology, but more practical disciplines of accounting, currency, weights and measures, geography, history, and modern languages. Of necessity, they were extremely literate. They constituted the target readership for Armenian book publishing, whose 500th anniversary we, of course, are celebrating this year. The first Armenian book, as you know, was published in Venice in 1512. In the 17th century, the merchants of, obviously, Ujulfa, established by Shah Abbas in 1604, created a school to train their sons in these secular disciplines. Granted the interaction of Armenians and Europeans, both in Europe itself, for example in France and Holland, as well as different Near Eastern centers like Aleppo and, of course, Ujulfa, and the skills that the Armenians possessed, it is understandable that they were very useful to the European powers, particularly to France, as couriers, emissaries, ambassadors, etc. And Armenian merchant communities were also courted by the Roman Church in its renewed missionary imperative after the Counter-Reformation from the 16th century onwards. So we put all these factors together, and they all form the background to the reprise of Armenian drama in 1668 in the then eastern Polish city of Lvov, now the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, up here. So this is where we find the reprise of Armenian drama. Here we find the Armenian church. Armenian churches existed there already from the 11th century. And here we have the gate, which is on Armenian Street in Lviv. So the earliest modern Armenian play was composed in Lviv for the Armenian community, but by a Frenchman, a French missionary, Father Louis-Marie Pidou, as part of his outreach to the local Armenian community to send their sons to receive an education at the recently opened Papal Academy. This play, which I personally have been working on for some years, is a martyrdom of Saint Hrypsime. This is the main focus of the play. Of course, she was martyred for her faith at the turn of the 4th century, and this has facilitated the acceptance of Christianity as the official religion of the Armenian court. And this suggests a convergence of strategic interests between France's desire to cultivate the image of a protector of Near Eastern Christians in the 17th, 18th centuries, and at the same time, the aspirations of Armenian merchants, along with the Meliks of Karabakh and the church hierarchy, to re-establish their kingdom in fulfillment of an ancient prophecy concerning military aid from the West, from the Franks, i.e. from West Europeans. The structure and plot of this play mirror the conventions of Jesuit school drama. This was, of course, developed in the 16th century to combine experience in public speaking with teaching morals and knowledge of the Bible and church history. So the structure of the play follows the Jesuit school drama very closely, and of course, so also does the subject. This school drama was fundamental in the development of national theatre and opera in several European countries, including Russia. The play reveals the influence of an earlier play of the 17th century, also written by a Frenchman, also on an Armenian subject. And that is the tragedy you see here, Polyktos, of 1640, this Armenian martyr of Malatia, by Pierre Corneille. And he himself, this major French tragedian Corneille, had also received a Jesuit schooling. And we see that, in fact, there was a great deal of French interest in Armenian topics, and there were a whole range of plays on Armenian subjects written in the 17th and 18th centuries in France and other West European countries. So I'm just going to mention two out of a whole range. I've found at least 20, 30 so far, and I haven't been looking too closely. This next one, here you see the frontispiece of this play, Arsas, Roi d'Arménie. So Arshak, King of Armenia, and this is by Pierre Corneille's teacher. This is by Claude Delibel. And I have one more to show you today. This is another play on an Armenian theme, Radanis et Zenobi. This tragedy, you can see the date, 1735, and this is by Prosper de Crébillon, the elder, aîné. Although earlier, women's parts had been discouraged in school drama, Pidou's work, naturally, of course, includes at least two women's parts. One, of course, will be the heroine, Saint Ripsime, and of course the other will be her spiritual guide, Gaiane. And what's very interesting is that we actually have the original dramatis personae. We have the original list of who played the various parts in this drama when it was first performed in Lvov in 1668. And the women's parts were played by women, not by men or boys. So that's a very interesting development. At the turn of the 18th century, here of course we see Mihitar Sebastien. He founded his brotherhood under papal supremacy for the renewal of Armenian education and spirituality. The monk's vow until today is Vasul Kronitz Yavhayr Yats, for religion and fatherland. And we see in their writings and publications an involvement in the process of Armenian nationalism. Along with their production of reference grammars, dictionaries, and histories, they fostered a patriotic commitment to the ideals of the great figures of the Armenian past by adopting the same structure of Jesuit drama in their own schools, first in Venice, then in Constantinople, the Crimea, and of course elsewhere. And these were founded, of course, with merchant capital from the 1730s well into the 19th century. Later, the concept spread to the new merchant schools in the Russian Empire, in Tiflis, Yerevan, Nor-Nakhichevan, etc., as part of this new Europeanized curriculum. The pursuit of this type of historical tragedy, which had developed in France and Italy by Armenians, was also unprecedented in the Near East at this time. So the very fact of the modern tradition of drama beginning in 1668, with a whole series of new plays being created by the ligaturists from the 1730s onwards, this is quite unique in the Near East. In the 19th century, the growing European middle class wanted to see their issues and problems reflected on stage. And this gave rise to the genre of bourgeois domestic comedy. The first Armenian example of this type of play dates from 1821 and derives from one of the richest communities of the contemporary Armenian diaspora, i.e. in India. Where again we observe that the Armenians are acting as intermediaries between the British East India Company and the local Indian princely class. The Indo-Armenian community was one of the most advanced at this time, and I'm sure that you're well aware of some of their major productions. They produced a plan for the creation of an Armenian liberation force to liberate the Armenian homeland. Back in the 1760s, they produced a draft constitution for a liberated Armenian state as a democratic republic in the 1780s. And they produced the first Armenian newspaper, the Astarar, in the 1790s. It was also advanced in featuring voluntary organizations, many of which we see played a major role in the Ottoman Empire and in Iran in the 19th century. Already in the 18th century, this is a major feature of life in the Indo-Armenian community. They also expanded the school network, both for boys and girls. The very first Armenian girls' school established in Calcutta in the 1790s. Again, this is a major new initiative. And raising the level of the community's cultural appreciation, national awareness, and ultimately aspirations toward renewed statehood in the Ottoman and Russian empires from the mid-19th century onwards. And here I'd like to show you then the frontispiece of this play. This play, the first modern Armenian comedy from 1821. And you can see the title, Khdratima Tishrov Chan. Khdratima Tishrov Chan. Though this realist play by Migotic Margosian, based on the English Restoration comedy, contains a number of humorous scenes, its fundamental focus is on the corruption widespread in the merchant class, who sought to purchase recognition and status on account of their wealth. The play's contemporary concern is already apparent in the title, Chudratima Tishrohu Chan. Chudratima is physiognomist. Tishrohu Chan is Terjohu Chan, from the root truj. Of course, this is duplicity. So you put the whole thing together, the physiognomist of duplicity. And the author then seeks to unmask the main character's scheming machinations as practitioners of the pseudoscience of physiognomy. At that time, they claimed that they could read a person's character just from looking at the characteristics then of their face. And so this has been borrowed by the writer to unmask the major hero's issues. In fact, in many ways, he comes across as being an anti-hero. The work is interesting for its portrayal of Armenian life in the metropolis of Calcutta. We see that there are a number of scenes in the houses of rich merchants. They're being waited on by their Bengali servants, and they speak about Bengali, written in Armenian characters in the play. The less educated Armenians speak in the dialect of New Julfa, particularly, of course, the merchants, and the more educated characters, including a teacher and a poet, they speak in classical Armenian. So far, we've seen that modern Armenian drama was largely a phenomenon of the diaspora, and I'm emphasizing this precisely to indicate the impact then of globalization. The globalized diaspora is therefore the means by which these new developments in theatre reach an Armenian audience. So it starts in the diaspora, not in the historic homeland, nor in the two main centres of that time, which of course are Constantinople, the Ottoman capital, and Tiflis, the administrative hub of the Viceroyalty of Transcaucasia in the Russian Empire since 1844. The ethos of nationalism and civil society, which was expanded by modern Armenian theatre, was totally unrepresentative of the mass of the population on the land, involved in an agrarian economy, in which money circulation was not very advanced, and where, especially in the Ottoman Empire, Armenian identity was constructed on the basis of religion. So being part of the Armenian millet meant being a communicant member of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Under the spiritual and secular direction of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So shared history, language, and other determinants of ethnic identity were not so crucial. And in fact, from the 1770s, the West Syrian Church, so the Asoragan Yegerzi, Asurinere, they were part of the Armenian millet, although they were not, of course, ethnically Armenian, but they were in communion with the Armenian Church. And many provincials then had ceased at that time to have fluency in the Armenian language. As a result, at that time, the church then produced an increasing amount of devotional material in Hayadar Turkaren, in Armeno-Turkish, in order to cater for their needs. Since the incorporation of West Armenia into the Ottoman Empire, Armenians like Greeks, Albanians, Jews, and other minorities became active in several cultural areas of what was a multi-ethnic environment of Ottoman society, particularly in the capital and in large cities like Smyrna. And I'd just like to say a little about this period then of Armenian theatre too. One theatrical form in which Armenians participated was a type of shadow theatre called karagöz, literally black eye. after the main character in these extemporized plots. Very much like English Punch and Judy shows, if you've had a chance to see those anytime. Apparently, this art form is of Chinese origin and seems to have been introduced to Anatolia by the Mongols, where it subsequently became indigenized. The flat puppets, as you can see, were manipulated from behind, and the screen was backlit. Normally, two would be involved in dialogue per scene. Many of the stock characters were of different ethnic backgrounds. Sometimes we see that one is Greek, one is a Jew, very often called Zakaria, and one is Armenian, with the stock name Serkis, obviously Sarkis, who was often cast as an ayvaz, a servant in a large Turkish house assigned with going to the market and accompanying the woman of the house on their excursions. The performances were mainly held during Ramadan and were often enacted in coffee houses before an exclusively male audience, a circumstance which obviously contributed to the sexual scenes that these plots regularly included. Another type of related play was Orta Oyunu, and as the name suggests, this was usually performed in a public square. Here too, there were a number of ethnic groups that appeared, and in this case, the Armenian figure tended to be a jeweler or goldsmith. So here you see an example, and I just want to point out before we change the slide that it's very unusual actually for a woman to be so close to the screen. Normally they sit behind a wall so that they hear and they don't actually see, and they're not actually part of the audience directly. The Zene, or the woman's role, was played until modern times by a male actor in female costume, like the convention, of course, in traditional Japanese theatre. The impact of some of these plays of Orta Oyunu may be detected in some of Hagop Baronian's works. But as already indicated, the main direction taken by Armenian theatre is more closely attuned to developments in Europe. Consequently, although the Ottoman Karagiz tradition still lives out a tenuous existence in modern Turkey and Greece, and here we have a billboard for a Greek Karagiz performance. So, o Karagizis, o Megas Alexandros και το καταρωμένο φίδι, Alexander the Great and the Accursed Snake. So that's the name of this particular play that is being advertised. But the point is that Karagiz has long since disappeared almost without trace from the Armenian cultural landscape. Similarly, the bardic genre of the ashur, literally the lover, the ashik, a more recent variant of the figure of the gusan that we talked about, this developed in the 16th century, and we have a number of Armenian figures that are witnessed from the 17th. This is still a vibrant cultural force in Central Asia, and even in the eastern provinces of Turkey. But in the Armenian environment, this is largely restricted to the Armenian Republic. And even there, it is struggling to survive under pressure from a variety of more modern international musical styles. Yeah, this is actually Ashur Shiri, very important earlier in the 19th century. So, great. Yeah, Mehita's drama was performed in the school hall, and those voluntary organizations we talked about, for example in India, they performed drama in their own cultural centres. And of course, theatre was only one of our multiple of activities that these groups were engaged in. So as yet, Armenian theatre had no institutional existence, no separate space. And here is where we see the next major development. This, of course, takes place then in Tiflis, there with the Kura River. The next step was taken in 1836. And this is by a prominent Tiflis merchant, Kalus Shermazanyan. Later in his life, he actually became the mayor of Tiflis in the 1860s. But in 1836, he had this great interest in theatre, and this had been sparked in him by going with his father to Western Europe and to places like Leipzig, where he actually witnessed dramatic performances. And he became so fascinated that he transformed the first floor of his town mansion in Tiflis into a theatre. And he held regular performances in his salon, staging plays that he himself had written, as well as those of Molière and others. Shermazanyan anticipated by some 8 years the creation of the first Russian theatre in Tiflis, and this was by the first viceroy, Count Vorontsov, who became a great patron of Caucasian drama in all 3 Caucasian languages, Armenian, Georgian, and Azerbaijan, during his tenure in Tiflis. After the definition of theatre as a distinct institution with its own space, one of the final criteria for the modern theatre was the establishment of a professional company of actors. This novelty developed in Constantinople with the creation of the Armenian Apostolic, 1846 to 66. And in addition to regular plays, it also featured circus performances. So it was, again, somewhat diversified in the beginning. Already at that time, its troupe comprised Armenian actresses, as well as French and Italian female dancers. This was succeeded by the Arevelian Tadron, the Eastern Theatre, and the Gedik Pasha Tadron, formed in the 1860s. Although by this time, in one sense, Armenian theatre already had a long history behind it, still many of the plays on their repertoire were translated from French and Italian. In addition, they staged tragedies on nationalist themes by former militarist pupils, such as the Romantic poets Migotich Beşiktaşyan and Tofma Persyan. Indeed, figures like Beşiktaşyan were equally active in the movement to obtain a greater measure of democracy in the Armenian millet. And this resulted, of course, in the promulgation of the Armenian constitution in 1863. Meanwhile, Persyan also wrote the libretto for the first Armenian opera by, of course, Dikran Chukhacan, with its theme, of course, of Arshak II. And Dikran Chukhacan was also significantly involved in theatrical performances, for a number of which he wrote and conducted incidental music, background music, as well as in orchestral and choral concerts, which were held in the auditorium of the Eastern Theatre. So this then became a venue for several performing arts among the Armenian community in Constantinople. And here again, as we said, this first Armenian opera, again reflecting the militarist interest in ancient Armenian history, we have scenes then from the life of King Arshak II of the 4th century, treating Armenian struggles against Sasanian Iran. And as some of you may remember, this was performed, of course, by San Francisco Opera back in 2001 in its original version as it left the pen of the author Chukhacan, not with the later additions and changes which were introduced in Yerevan around about 1935. In addition to works in Armenian, the Armenian companies of Constantinople frequently produced plays also in Turkish, either in original or in translation. And this became an important nucleus for the development of what was to become a national Turkish theatre. So again, the process of globalization. Not only did Armenians receive it, they also passed it on to their neighbours. And this, I think, is a very important cultural development. Armenian actresses were ubiquitous on the Turkish stage well until after the creation of the Republic, since it was considered immoral for a Muslim woman to appear on stage. In this way, Armenian theatre not only adopted all the conventions of its European counterpart, but also participated in the dissemination of this art among the Ottomans as well as in Iran throughout the 19th century also. In the 1870s and 80s, we see a transition to realist satire of social and political subjects by figures like Hagop Baronian, who himself was a frustrated actor and a very perceptive drama critic. Beginning under the influence of the Italian dramatist Goldoni, the French dramatist Molière, and the conventions of the earlier Ottoman theatre, Baronian later developed his own signature style, which has endeared him to generations of spectators. For example, the plot of Balthasar Akhtar has affinities with Molière's Job d'Ardin, but Baronian has developed Molière's rather conventional handling of the topic of marital infidelity on the part of the wife, updating the subject matter, rendering the situation more pointed, and associating it with the debate in contemporary Armenian society on Armenian women's role, and proposed policies to allow women greater emancipation, particularly in the areas of romance and marriage, as well as education and work. Such issues were further developed by the first Armenian feminist writers, like Zabel Asadur. And we see this particularly in a play that she wrote, Harsa, The Bride, which presented the public with a new paradigm of social interaction and the status of the Armenian woman. Thus, theatre had already established itself as an enlightened sphere where men and women could socialize freely outside the restrictions normally operating in the Ottoman Empire, as was noted in performances of Orta Oyunu. Unfortunately, the opportunities for the development of West Armenian theatre were cut short as a result of the apprehensions of the reactionary Sultan Abdulhamid II, that the Armenian stage might act as a hotbed of sedition. And you can well understand. So for someone that banned the publication of the word freedom, even the word freedom was already a major danger in itself. You imagine that you have hundreds of people who are assembled in a theatre. This already is a very emotional situation. People reach an emotional high. Actors also are involved in quite a lot of ad-lib, of leaving the text behind, adding something of their own. Somehow someone blurts something out. People feel, aha, yes, this is right. This is what we want. They pour out of the theatre, and who knows where this may end. So you can see the whole issue then of the social and the political impact of theatre, enormously important, especially in the 19th century. So far we've been talking about the capital, but Armenian theatre in the later 19th century also spread out to the 6 eastern provinces in the Ottoman Empire. And I'd just like to highlight one point, which is the 4 plays which were composed by Tilgadinci. Tilgadinci, of course, who was much better known as a short story writer in the area, of course, of Harpert, which you see on the map there. What's very significant is that Tilgadinci had never actually seen a play being performed. He never saw a play being performed, he only read them. And so as a result, you can see that from his work as a short story writer, there is a wonderful, pithy, realistic dialogue, but the construction of the play is rather weak. So it's obviously one thing to begin. It's quite hard actually to bring a play to a conclusion. And I think that you can actually see this in his works. They are a little amateurish, but nevertheless, it's wonderful that he turned his hand to that. And his plays were enormously effective locally. In fact, if I could just interject one anecdote on this, there was someone who was in charge of this major Armenian institution in Harpert. I think it was an old folks' home, but had not been maintaining his task properly. And in fact, there's a suggestion that perhaps he was even purloining money, putting it into his own pocket and not into the exchequer of the old folks' home. And so in one of these plays, Tilgadinci actually writes in a part for someone in a very similar situation. And immediately the person, of course, comes, unaware of what is going to happen, comes and is present then in the theatre, sees the play, immediately recognizes that he is the one being targeted, and decides immediately to leave town. So the play was enormously effective. While West Armenian literature in Constantinople was more influenced by French and Italian models, East Armenian culture, like Russian, looked to Germany and Northern Europe for its inspiration. Building on the enthusiasm of student groups in Moscow in the 1850s, an Armenian professional company came into being in Tiflis in the next decade. And the moving spirit was none other than Gabriel Sedukyan, the earliest dramatist whose work is still part of the contemporary repertoire. So the contemporary repertoire really for modern Armenian theatre begins with Sedukyan's Khatabala. Written, of course, mainly in the Tiflis dialect, his plots deal with the transformation of Caucasian society under capitalism and modernism. This affected business practices, including the expanding role of the moneylender, the investment banker, as well as a whole series of legal issues under the reforms of Alexander II in the 1860s. And wealth, of course, is a means of upward mobility, rather than the static categories of lineage and land that we find before. The family unit also becomes a subject to strains between traditional values and practices and the new fashions influenced by Europe. For example, the extended family over the nuclear family, the debate over the relation of romantic love and marriage, the emancipation of women, as we saw earlier on in Constantinople. So, this type of dramaturgy found its natural continuator in Alexander Shirvanzadeh, a naturalist who had the opportunity to tour Europe several times. Significantly, with him, the time lag between author and model was greatly reduced. So if Baronian was mainly influenced by Molière, who lived about a century and a half before Baronian, then the chief mentor of Shirvanzadeh was his older contemporary, the Norwegian Henrik Ibsen. Shirvanzadeh grew up in Baku, which since the 1870s had become the Russian Empire's industrial hub, attracting international investment of the caliber of the Nobel brothers and the Paris Rothschilds for its oil wells. The workers' exploitation in the prevailing unregulated get-rich-quick atmosphere features in several of Shirvanzadeh's novels and his dramas, as for example in For the Sake of Honor, Badvi Hamar, which began to play just as the first labor agreement in the Russian Empire was being signed, after the unprecedented strike of 1903. Like George Bernard Shaw, Shirvanzadeh was a socialist who valued Ibsen's handling of socio-political issues. So Shirvanzadeh had this drama, Uner Iravuka, Did She Have the Right, of 1902. And this is heavily influenced by Ibsen's Doll's House. And like its predecessor, it culminates in the abandonment of a devoted wife of her children. And of course, this was a very, very hard situation then for a Caucasian audience to accept, because she felt she could no longer live under the restrictive control of her husband. Nationalist discourse was particularly enriched at the turn of the 20th century by the impact of ethnography, investigating the legends of the Armenian ethnogenesis preserved by Lovsis Horometsi, and of course the oral epic Daredevils of Sassoon, Sasnatsoreh. This in part was meant to bridge the gap between regional and metropolitan theatre, as well as between the West Armenian tradition of Constantinople and the Eastern tradition of Tiflis. It gave rise to the neo-pagan literary movement, with which, to some extent, the next major playwright was connected, i.e. Levon Shant. Having studied in Germany, it is understandable that he was influenced by Wagner, in the employment of myth and his conception of opera as uniting the arts of music, song, dance, decor, and more sophisticated lighting in the service of a comprehensive aesthetic ideal. And I think we could well argue that these insights are significantly embodied in two of Shant's more mature plays, Ancient Gods, Yinas Vatsner of 1909, and a play that is very, very little read and almost never performed, but should be. This is the Shukhtaivadze of 1918, The Chain. Moreover, the main character, so going back to Ancient Gods, of this monastic community, he desires to destroy the new church that they are building because he regards it as being tainted with ambivalent devotion and petrified thought forms. He acts as a mouthpiece for Shant's Nietzschean philosophy, the philosophy of Overman, Übermensch, and its application through will to power along the same lines as his close associate Avedik Isahakian had done in his very powerful poem Abulal al-Mahari, composed in exactly the same year of 1909. And of course, as the West Armenian poet Daniel Varujan expressed in his poem Vahagen around the same time. So West Armenian cultural life was totally disrupted by the genocide. And the first phase, of course, was precisely the removal of the most prominent men of public standing. Nevertheless, gradually, new diasporan centres emerged, such as Beirut, where, of course, Shant settled in the late 1920s. Later, in 1942, the Kaspar Ipekian theatrical group emerged, which kept his work alive and acted as a catalyst for the creation of new dramatic works, such as those of Musher Ishkhan. More recently, figures like Vahe Berberian, our own, of course, more recently in LA, have attracted attention for their more irreverent treatment of the diaspora, and in particular with regard to Vahe Berberian, this very fascinating play that he produced, Vartakui Pire, the Pink Elephant, about the surreal atmosphere of Armenian cultural life in Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War. Only with the First Armenian Republic, after the fall of the Russian Empire, does the new capital, Yerevan, begin to function as a significant cultural centre, and the first theatre company was established there in 1922. As is understandable, the dramaturgy of chant was largely neglected in the Armenian Republic during the Soviet period because of its association first with symbolism and of course also with nationalism. But since the early 1990s, there has been a major revival of several chant plays on various stages in Yerevan. Indeed, the Sulukhyan Theatre of Yerevan also brought chants Hinast Vatsner, Ancient Gods, to LA round about 5 years ago. Perhaps some of you actually you were present and saw it. The course taken by Armenian drama in the Soviet period closely parallels that of the other republics of the USSR. In the early 1920s, the poet Yelisey Charets experimented with new theatrical forms, improvising large-scale spectacles with mass, non-professional participation, on the theory that the new society demanded a radically new kind of art. With the growth of Stalinism, the role of ideology, centrally formulated and implemented, this began to make itself more noticeable. Censorship harnessed artistic freedom to the tenets of socialist realism. At the same time, in the run-up to World War II, and here again I want to emphasize then this role of Armenians in disseminating this cultural form of theatre. So in the run-up to World War II, we see the establishment of a separate Kurdish theatre in the Armenian Republic. On the basis of pre-existing groups, a travelling Kurdish state theatre was based in the town of Abaran. It gained approval in 1937, and then the following year it moved to a more permanent location in Alagyaz, where the theatre existed for about a decade, in which it performed Armenian classics like Sundukyan's Pepo and a stage version of Tumanyan's short story Giko, as well as works by Kurdish writers like Shaibon, Jabarli, and Mutvinani. In 1975, another company known as the Kurdish People's Theatre functioned in Alagyaz until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, as you know, at that point, there was an exchange of population. The Armenians, of course, of Azerbaijan moved to the Armenian Republic, and the Kurds of the Armenian Republic moved to Azerbaijan, and that brought that theatre to an end. But I think that clearly the Kurdish population in the Armenian Republic greatly appreciated this opportunity then to create this type of theatre in Armenia. In the aftermath of World War II, theatre also had a role to play in the Cold War. Under Khrushchev, a new generation of writers and artists developed, like the poet Varur Sevag, film directors like Frunze Dovlatyan, Sergei Parajanov, began to re-explore topics which previously were taboo, such as nationalism and the significance of the individual. Examples of this greater latitude on stage include this work by Araxmanyan, 60 Years and 1 Hour, of 1965. This treated the Stalinist purges in Siberia, and Zhora Harutyunyan's Kor Verchin Hankarvana, Your Last Haven, and this deals with two brothers who emigrate to Armenia from the diaspora after the war. One of them resettles in the USA because of the corruption that he finds in his homeland. Social criticism was also more incisive, as in a farce by Giray Ananyan, Im Dune Ko Dune Che. It's of course a variation of Ahlan Wasahlan. Yeah, my house is not your house. And the whole point behind it is it pokes fun at the rigors of the Soviet bureaucracy in allocating city apartments. In the 1960s, of course, there was such an expansion of the population of Yerevan. They wanted to reach the magic number of 1 million in order to receive the right to have a subway, etc., etc. So they were pulling hundreds of thousands of people into the capital, and there was no place to put them. So my house is not your house, because the same apartment was allotted to 2 different families. And so all through the play, they're struggling to find different ways to come to a resolution. Berge Zetutsian, I think it's a wonderful photo of him, is one of the most celebrated living Armenian playwrights. He's a younger contemporary who began writing for the stage in 1974. The key to all of his prose works is the relation between the individual and society, and the proper exercise of political power. It emerges in one of his very first plays, Amenadachur Martyr, the saddest man. And this is a portrayal of the pursuit of freedom in a totalitarian state. It reflects very much the trial of the Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He also wrote a screenplay for the work Yerevanian Oreli Chronika, The Chronicle of Yerevan Days. It was a film of 1972. He also has a play of 1981, Anavad Menachosuchuna, unfinished dialogue, unfinished monologue, and this focuses on bureaucrats who deliberately depart from the centrally dictated command structure to apply their own initiative to assist ordinary citizens. He has a number also of more nationalist works, one of which is Medz Luruchuna, the Great Silence. This is on the murder of the poet Daniel Barujan at the beginning of the genocide, and Volki Danaranna Galis, All Rise, the court is in session, and this dramatizes the trial of Solomon Tehlirian for killing Talat Pasha. And I should say, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to go to the Suzukian Theatre in Yerevan. You know, it's a huge barn of a place. It seats something like 1,200. Wow. I've been present in that auditorium when they have played, what was it again yesterday? Volki Darananda, so All Rise, the court is in session, and there wasn't a single empty seat in the whole of the auditorium. 1,200 people who have come to see that play for the umpteenth time by Berge Zetutsian. Quite remarkable. Already in his very first play, the influence of the Italian Pirandello can be observed in Zetutsian's desire to deconstruct theatrical convention, and in particular, the absolute control of the author. In one of his more recent works, Zilvelel Mahatzel, Born and Died, of 1995, this is taken to its logical conclusion. So he queries a whole series of distinctions between the director and the actor, the stage and the audience, performance and rehearsal, and real-life unscripted dialogue. And this is under the influence also of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. There was a performance of that play at the Mark Taylor Forum only last month. The tumultuous events of the last 2 decades, the impact of Glasnost, the earthquake, the Karabakh movement, the dissolution of the USSR, the emergence of another Armenian Republic, have inevitably spawned new literary and artistic trends reflecting the broader socio-political and economic changes both in the homeland and in diaspora communities worldwide. The current transition between the collapse of one established paradigm and the creation of another produces an excellent occasion for applying the insights of theatre of the absurd, well illustrated by the work of younger playwrights like Alahid Arasabian and Galine Khodikyan. Plays of absurdist authors like Ionescu, which were banned for a public performance during the Soviet Union are finding resonance in this current environment. It is significant that while there are only 2 functioning cinemas in Yerevan, the Kino Naivi and Kino Moskva, there are 14 different theatre companies. 2 cinemas, 14 theatre companies, and this gives you an insight into the contemporary impact of the theatrical form. The image highlights the importance of the annual festivals, which bring a range of foreign theatre companies to Yerevan every September or October. So, by way of conclusion, I'd like to underline once more, in presenting this survey of Armenian theatre and drama, my plan has really been to emphasize the close connection that it has, on the one hand, with the project of nationalism, but also at a deeper level, with the project of the globalization of world economy. As a result of the Armenians' early participation in this international movement of transoceanic trade, the transition to a form of drama which has since gained almost universal application all over the world, including countries with a very strong indigenous theatrical tradition, and immediately you think of a place like India, and of course of Japan. Even there, we see the inroads of this universal type of modern drama. But it occurred, as we saw before, among Armenians at a much earlier point, precisely because they were so much more involved in this internationalizing process already from the 16th century onwards. Armenians then played an important role in disseminating this modern art form among their neighbors, be it the Turks, the Iranians, and also, as we saw, the Kurds, largely abandoning those more regional theatrical forms that they had practiced early on, such as Orta Oyunu and Karagöz. The logic of this argument then would suggest that as state sovereignty in economic and other matters is eroded, that it would be accompanied by similar developments in the cultural sphere. And this, of course, you can see very clearly with regard to the film industry. The process of globalization of film is already well advanced. But I would argue that this will not be the case with theatre to nearly the same degree. Because, of course, theatre, by its definition, is much more resilient as an art form, much less subject to impact by external, pre-packaged products like painting, sculpture, and music. The fact of its being predominantly a live medium, performance art, renders it less susceptible to the processes then of mass consumption. And its characteristic highlights dialogue. This means that, of course, it's primarily language specific. It doesn't travel very well. It has to be translated into other idioms. Consequently, I feel very optimistic about the medium-term future of Armenian theatre. So fundamentally, this is what I would like to. This is what I wanted to present to you. And now, if you have any questions, I'd be very pleased to try to answer them.